Let's talk about giant robot movies. Specifically, the kind of giant robot movie where uh, a Jaeger or a Gundam program has been set up to battle monsters that are coming out of the ocean, or a radioactive Godzilla that needs to be confronted by a huge doomsday machine, or sharks in a tornado. The reason that we need to talk about that before we get into any sort of a serious talk about what peace building means in the 21st century and what security and preparedness are going to mean for us in an age of exponential technology as we stand at the cusp of a fourth industrial revolution, and especially movies where giant robots fight giant monsters, is not just because these movies are cool. The reason we need to start thinking about these movies is because they, I think, capture very well in a microcosm what it means to be faced with an extinction level event or an existential threat, and what it means to have in our arsenal of defenses not just conventional weapons, not just guns and tanks, but lethally autonomous, gigantic doomsday machines of our own. And especially for practitioners of peace building. So, somebody like me who's worked in peacekeeping and who has worked in the disarmament sector, we are always thinking in this sector about how best to prepare our defenses to protect civilians against the wars of the future. We have our finger on the pulse of the latest technology in warfare. We think about what it would mean if a machine was lethally autonomous, even if it was being used for self-defense by a national army. What implications does that have for keeping the peace in a conflict situation? And what implications does it have for protecting the most marginalized and vulnerable people amongst us from the worst impacts of war? And increasingly, we've started thinking about this question a lot more. Not just because science fiction has given us this very interesting war gaming or mind experiment to play with in telling us what might be the kind of technological developments we have to be ready for, because these technological developments are already very much here. War is mutating in front of our eyes, and even as we speak, you and me right now in this talk, autonomous weapons, autonomous vehicles, whether they are tanks or drones, have already been deployed in battlefields around the world. The world today is sitting on an arsenal of nearly 20,000 nuclear warheads that have the destructive capability of blowing up this planet many times over. And we have to think about these extremely fraught and difficult questions of security in the context of one of the most challenging humanitarian times in our history as a planet. I'm not just talking about the COVID-19 pandemic. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic had hit us, the UN Humanitarian Office told us that 1 in every 45 people around the world was going to need humanitarian aid in the year 2020. This was much before the pandemic was even in our lives. For the first time since the 1990s, extreme poverty is set to rise around the world. And in just the last few months alone, because of the pandemic, about 25 years of development has been undone, and 110 million people around the world are facing the prospect of poverty. And we are doing this when there are more than 30 armed conflicts raging around the world, despite the call for a global ceasefire by the international community. So, in such a challenging environment, I often don't like to think about peace building. I like to think about giant robot movies and the kind of questions of ethics and philosophy in international law that they are preparing us for. Let's take a few examples. When we look at a movie that has people using lightsabers as personal weapons or phasers, we are compelled to think about what it means to give more lethality and bigger and stronger weapons to people for personal use or for personal defense. And there are so many movies that do this. A film talks about a doomsday device, and many movies do this, where a superhero team has to pick up this doomsday device and, from the supervillain, and take it into outer space where it can detonate safely away from civilian populations. We are compelled to think about what it would mean for us as nations and societies to defend ourselves against the threat of a weapon that is as dangerous as a nuclear weapon. When we think about, for example, super soldiers with serums injected in them, or we think about a shape-shifting android assassin like T-1000, we are compelled to think not just about what it means to have enhanced force capability, but we are compelled to think about future wars that will be fought by weapons or robots or any other kind of machine that is lethally autonomous, which means that it has the right to make a decision on who to kill in the event of a conflict without a lot of human agency being used on the basis of an algorithm that we've written into it, and what then justice means and what discrimination means in a circumstance like that where a machine has been authorized to take decisions. When we think about Jaegers and Gundams, we're not just thinking about maybe an enhanced suit for our soldiers. We are thinking about, again, a lethally autonomous weapon that has the agency to make decisions in the arena of war. When we think about an alien species, and you see this in a lot of science fiction movies as well, that has come down to Earth from another planet and is trying to terraform it, thereby posing the threat of an extinction event for everyone on the planet. We are thinking about conflicts that might be driven by climate change and how deeply our changing climate, our extreme weather events, the fact that there are now droughts in places where there used to be flourishing agriculture, is going to trigger forced displacement and migration and conflict, especially ethnic conflict over resources, in so many of the most difficult humanitarian contexts and environments around the world. But we also are compelled to think from this whole alien species discourse about a threat like COVID-19. Now, we know that COVID-19 is a pandemic that has spread so quickly around the world. But what if next time it was a weapon of mass destruction? A man-made biological weapon that was used and, released into the world? How quickly would that destroy our economy, set back development, throw us into one of the biggest recessions we have experienced in our lifetime, and rob the global economy of nearly $8 trillion? These are the threats that science fiction compels us to think about. But it also compels us to think about the essential fundamental principles of peace, of international law, of the way ethics are exercised by the international community, and those institutions and architectures of global governance that we've set up to save ourselves, not just succeeding generations from the scourge of war, but to save ourselves from weapons of mass destruction. It forces us to think about deterrence separately, because, deterrence is one thing when two countries have nuclear weapons, but what if a non-state actor gets a nuclear weapon? What does deterrence mean then? And the reason these questions are so tricky and so complex today in an age of exponential technology is because the history of arms control has always been interesting. It dates far back. As we think arms control is fairly contemporary, right? The Treaty on Nuclear Weapons was just signed 2 years ago, that for the first time ever outlaws nuclear weapons use or stockpiling anywhere in the world. But it goes as far back as the 12th century, when the Second Lateran Council outlawed crossbows. Crossbows were a revolutionary development in warfare and in hunting, so for economic activity as well, where for the first time you could kill someone from a distance using, an archer using a crossbow could do that. And the Lateran Council decided that this was an anathema to God and prohibited it. You move few centuries forward and you find yourself in the 17th century, where according to the Strasbourg Agreement, poison bullets were banned. But again, it's interesting how those ethics developed, because for a long time, a poison bullet was also in some parts of the world considered more humane when it was invented. Because if you shot someone with a poison bullet in a battlefield, that person was less likely to suffer because they would instantly die. So we've always had this back and forth between what it means to have a new technology or a new weapon be introduced into our arsenal of the way we do geopolitics, the way we conduct war with each other, and what it means to build peace. Because the most important thing for me is that the meaning of peace has not changed. With all our leaps in technology, from crossbows to the fourth industrial revolution, to machine learning, to lethally autonomous weapons, peace still means the same thing. To secure a population still means to give everyone a sense of security, a sense of freedom, to afford everyone an equal right to the resources that the country has, to afford everyone an equal opportunity to design and think about their future. Peace still means fairness. It still means the guarantee of life. It still means having the liberty to pursue happiness. So as contentious as our times are, and as difficult as it is to think about making new laws, or keeping up our preparedness against weapons of mass destruction and these new domains of warfare that have been presented to us. For example, now we're talking about a space force, we're talking about the cyber realm where war is now conducted, and the cyber architectures of countries are threatened. But peace has always meant the same thing. So what can we do better as the peace building community, the international community, and our structures of global governance in ensuring that in the face of these new existential threats, we are still able to create societies that feel safe, populations of civilians that feel secure, that no one is forcibly displaced, that violence is not used against women as an instrument of war. For me, there are 4 big developments that I want to talk about today that are absolutely critical in thinking about the wars of the future and the implications these new developments over the last few years or so have for the future of peace building and peacekeeping and of our security preparedness as an international community. The first of these, of course, as I've touched on many times earlier, is the 4th Industrial Revolution. Artificial intelligence is increasingly becoming a part of war around us today. Again, not an artifact of science fiction. Machine learning can now enable, for example, systems to write war architectures, in a hurry. So we've already have lethal autonomy. We have the use of drones that are making the decision makers feel a lot more detached from what is actually happening with boots on the ground. So earlier, where a human being would be, compelled to make an ethical decision about how much force to use in a particular context, now we might have a situation where someone who's sitting many, many thousands of miles away using a remote control has given a certain level of autonomy to the drone to make that decision. So they have a lower stake. Missile defense systems are now using machine learning, which has its advantages because it allows countries and alliances to work better together. An AI system can quickly talk to 2 systems and enable them to work together better. But does that also mean that, more sinister and belligerent forces in the international community will be able to do this better? We have automated intelligence processing software, which is a whole different Pandora's box, because while it has helped us strengthen national security, we also have the very critical question to think about of how biased algorithms are. Optimization is not neutrality. That is one of the big things we need to think about in thinking about wars of the future. Optimizing a system doesn't mean that it is neutral. A system that makes decisions more efficiently doesn't mean that the architect who made that system did not have any biases. So, for example, a facial recognition system that is worse at recognizing faces of a particular color, of a particular race than others, is something problematic, and we have to think about it the more we afford autonomy to these systems. The other interesting question that this new autonomous realm and artificial intelligence realm raises is whether peacekeeping is a fundamentally human activity. It's a fundamentally human function. While we can design machines to wage war very effectively on our behalf, can we have machines do peacekeeping? Or is empathy really a fundamentally human trait, and therefore peacekeeping can only be a human activity, something we have to think about? The second big development we need to talk about is weapons of mass destruction. And we have spoken about it as the international community at length. We have created architectures to control WMDs that are so successful and impactful today. For example, the Chemical Weapons Convention that has the sign off of more than 190 countries, and that was able to take such decisive and quick action when it was confronted with its first big challenge, which was the use of chemical weapons in Syria. We have had a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons recently. Modern diplomacy has succeeded to a great extent, as has deterrence, as has the civil society voices and movements that feed into it, in ensuring that we are safe to a certain extent from WMDs. But as I said earlier, the COVID-19 crisis has again raised the question of what if, it's one thing to have taken these decisive actions and ensuring that we are secure against nuclear weapons to some extent. But what if, a biological weapon was used in the same way that the COVID-19 pandemic has spread? Are we really prepared in terms of not only our security architectures, but our public health systems to deal with it? And how can we better regulate the biological weapons Convention and the biological weapon stockpiles that nations do have. The third big thing we need to think about today is the expanding domains of warfare. So warfare is not just about land, air, and sea anymore. Warfare is being waged in the cyber world. There are now, it's not just the hybrid forms where cyber technologies can be used to improve the way that a war is conducted between two countries, but our cyber architectures are all under threat from belligerent forces. Or for example, now we're talking about a space force, a domain that had been left peaceful, that there's a treaty on outer space and there's more or less an agreement between nations that space is not going to be a domain of warfare, of conflict. We do have the development of defense systems like the Space Force that are making us think about this question in a lot more detail. And finally, number 4, the wars of the future are not just about technology. I think increasingly we are being confronted with a situation where we have to think about wars of ideas. There is misinformation and hate speech and fake news spreading around the world today using the same instruments of technology, weaponizing the same social media, weaponizing the same internet that could be used to do good. But as I said earlier, technology has changed in leaps and bounds and autonomous vehicles roam the earth, but peace still means the same thing that it did back in the 12th century when the Lateran Council outlawed the crossbow. Peace still means fairness, decency, and dignity for the ordinary civilian citizen who has no stake in warfare. It still means a stable system of cooperation between countries around the world where we can really leverage the opportunity that has been given to us by globalization, by our architectures of global governance, to do better, to address problems like extreme poverty and hunger and people not having access to healthcare, instead of expending $1.8 trillion a year on our global military expenditure. And because peace still means the same thing, but conflict has evolved, we are going to have to get much smarter, and we are going to have to reiterate our humanity in the face of war that is becoming more machine than human every day. For me, there are 3 big things that we need to do, and with this, I would like to conclude my talk today. The first is these advances in artificial intelligence are incredibly useful and they are a force for good. It is our responsibility to nurture a 4th industrial revolution where drones can be used to deliver humanitarian aid, where technology can be used to take distance learning to students instead of being used as an instrument of warfare, even as we build our arsenals of defense against belligerents and non-state actors, which are very necessary. Secondly, we have to reiterate our faith in the social contract that we have created for ourselves in the form of international law, whether that is through treaties or through organizations that keep us safe. And finally, we have to make security a broader agenda. It's not just about controlling the arsenals of weapons around the world today. It's about making security about equality, about development, about doing the best doing the best for those who have been left the farthest behind. That, to me, truly is peace, and a peace that can be achieved no matter how exponential our leaps in technology and no matter how big our weapons in the future are. Watch more science fiction movies and think about it.